Okay. Okay, thank you all for coming on this late August afternoon. I'm Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, and it is my pleasure to be introducing our discussion today on Sam Tadros' new book, Motherland Lost, the Egyptian and Coptic Quest for Modernity. And Sam, of course, is a research fellow here at the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, and he is a rapidly rising star in the Washington policy circles. He has really only been in our country a few years, having graduated in a master's program from Georgetown University. He came to work at Hudson soon after, even actually while he was a student, and he is now, seems to be everywhere in the media. His piece in the Wall Street Journal was printed today, but he frequently writes for the Journal and other publications. He lectures in academia. He lectures at Johns Hopkins, a graduate program on international affairs. And also, he is well respected in policy circles. So Sam grew up in Cairo and attended American University, Cairo. He founded there the Union of Egyptian Liberal Youth, and now he has been with us writing and giving his analysis for almost 2 years. And introducing Sam's book and discussing it will be Robert Satloff, who is executive director of the extremely well-respected Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And Rob is an old friend and expert on Arab and Islamic politics and U.S. policy, U.S. diplomacy. His recent books have included one on the battle of ideas in the war on terror, for which he lived in the Middle East for a couple years to research that book. And also a very fascinating book along the lines of this topic today, called Among the Righteous, and it was about the Holocaust's reach into the Arab lands. And Rob got his degrees from Harvard and a PhD from Oxford. He's a prolific writer, and his analysis can be found on his website, www.washingtoninstitute.org. Today's topic is extremely timely. Last weekend, there was attacks in Egypt, a persecution, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 14th century against the Coptic Christian minority in Egypt. Scores of churches were burned, looted, otherwise damaged. Other institutions, Bible institutions, monasteries, a monastery that dates back to the 4th or 5th century was destroyed. Convents, Franciscan nuns were paraded as prisoners of war in the streets and jeered by supporters of former President Morsi. The Muslim Brotherhood has incited such attacks, blaming the Copts for the suppression of the protests, the sit-ins that were actually conducted by the military, which the Copts had nothing to do with. And the Copts were only one of many factions, including the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, who supported the ouster of Morsi to begin with on July 3rd. So the discussion today will, of course, talk about the history of these people. Who are they? What have they been going through? And really, what does their presence and contribution to Egypt mean for Egypt itself? So join me in welcoming our guest today.
Thank you, Nina. It's It's a great pleasure to be here at the Hudson Institute, which is an enormously influential actor in the Washington policy debate, and I'm privileged to be here to talk about Sam Tadros' book. Let me first make an announcement on behalf of Nina and Hudson. Here they want you to keep your cell phones on. Turn them to silent, but tweet as much as you like. It's a real privilege, as I was saying, to be here to talk about Sam Tadros' book. I'll say at the outset, I'm a Sam Tadros fan. I think this is an outstanding book. It's a gem of a book. And I want to make 4 points. And what we're going to do in our procedure here is I'm going to offer a bit of a book review and make 4 major points. And then I'm going to discuss these with Sam. And then we're going to open this up for discussion and debate with all of you. But I get first to make observations about this gem of a book. It's not just an insightful and sensitive look at the world of Coptic Christianity. Sam has written a very brave book. It could easily have been, in Motherland Lost, it could easily have been merely a litany of persecution. I say merely with a sense of enormous tragedy, because that would have been justified. Copt versus Rome, Copt versus Byzantium, Copt versus Muslim, Copt versus Protestant, Copt versus Europe, Copt versus Arab. The list goes on. And the legacy of persecution and tragedy on top of persecution and tragedy is so profound that alone would have merited a deep history by a historian like Sam Tadros. But Sam goes further than that, because he also frames his narrative in terms of Copt versus Copt, a brutally honest portrayal of the internal divisions, laity versus clergy, Pope versus bishops, hermits versus church administration, rich versus poor, accommodationist versus communalist, etc. Sam bears it all. He bears the external history of tragedy and persecution, as well as the internal tensions, which have been at the heart of the Coptic story for almost 2 millennia. It is, at some points, a tale of intrigue among popes and metropolitans and monasteries and conferences, but it is a story of texture and depth. And it is a remarkable story that Sam portrays in all its dimensions. And I think it's really quite a courageous story for doing that. Sam's book, secondly, is courageous in another way. He takes on the pillars of accepted wisdom about Egyptian history, Albert Harani, for example, and he skewers them with delicacy and precision and subtlety. The target, first and foremost, is the conventional idea of Egypt's liberal age. Now, there's an awful lot of nostalgia in the study of the modern Middle East. One piece, for example, concerns the idea of a golden age, the idea that Muslims and Jews lived together in peace and harmony, about a millennia ago. Well, as we know, there is more fiction than reality there. The Golden Age was quite limited in both time and space, and was really an outlier in Arab and Muslim history. Though it's important to note that until very recently, it was always better to be born a Jew in Muslim lands than to be born a Jew in Christendom. But that's a different story for a different event. But similarly, there's a conventional narrative about Arab history concerning a liberal age, not a golden age, but a liberal age, especially Egypt's liberal age in the early decades of the 20th century, the time of Zaghlul, the Waft, the Constitution, etc., when Muslims and Copts banished their sectarian and religious identities to forge a single peoplehood. Now, this remarkably timed book explains in eye-opening fashion how there is more fiction than fact in that idea, that idealized idea as well. He explains how that idea came to be. He explains how so many Copts bought into the idea, and why, therefore, this idea of a liberal age that was never truly liberal persists until today. And that gives rise to some of the ahistorical nature of the Egyptian political debate that exists today. And that brings me to a third key point, because this very thin tome explains an enigma behind today's headlines. It explains an enigma behind today's politics. Why is it, here's the enigma, why is it that the secular elite that went into the streets in January and February 2011 to force the ouster of one longtime general, Hosni Mubarak, today is the same secular elite behind the empowerment of another general, Sisi, and the crackdown that is now underway against the partisans of the former president and the Muslim Brotherhood more general? How is it that that same secular elite fought for liberalism and democracy 2 years ago, and today supports, you can call it whatever you'd like, but it's difficult to say it's a liberal and democratic movement in Egypt against the forces of darkness, the forces of the Muslim Brotherhood, all in the name of reform and change? The answer, as Sam masterfully explains, not knowing that this book would be coming out in the middle of this moment, the answer that Sam gives is that the process of political evolution in Egypt is almost the opposite of what we think is the process of political evolution here in America. For us, government, the very idea of government in the American idea, the very idea of government is to limit the power of the state. And our freedoms, as much as anything else, are freedoms from government, from the abusive power of the state. But Sam explains brilliantly that in Egypt, freedom, liberalism, independence actually springs from the state itself. The state is the giver, the fount of education, of opportunity, of rights. The state is the source. And perhaps this harkens back to the pharaonic, perhaps this harkens back to Muhammad Ali, perhaps this harkens back to whatever. But it is a very different source of political dynamic than what we are used to here. And if you believe that the state is the source, the giver of rights, the protector of liberties, then empowering the state and empowering the strongest arm of the state, namely the military, is sort of the height of what it means to be, in this context, liberal. Because the state is the source of freedom. It turns on its head the way we understand it here in America, but it makes perfect sense the way Sam has explained the Egyptian dynamic. So by supporting the supremacy of the state against provocateurs and terrorists is, in the Egyptian political discourse, to be liberal, to be free. Read this book and a light bulb goes off over your head, explaining what to many Americans might be unexplainable. And that is a real gift. Look, fourthly, I wanted to just make a comment about what comes through as a sense of personal tragedy. Look, only at the end of the book, first in a footnote, and then just one reference in the text, do we meet Sam Tadros himself as part of the story of an historic exodus of Copts, part of a new dynamic that turns on its head 1,900 years of history and begins with the Copts embarking on something totally new and totally unknown. You know, one of Bernard Lewis's many insightful observations about Muslim life in the contemporary era has to do with migration. For 1,300 odd years, Muslims never voluntarily took themselves from lands of Muslim control and migrated to be minorities in lands of non-Muslim control. That changed, Professor Lewis noted, that changed in the middle of the last century with the movement of Muslims from Turkey into Central Europe, North Africa into French-speaking Europe, and the subcontinent into British-held territories. That trend was only 1,300 years old. We have one even older that is just now beginning to get underway. The movement of Copts after 1,900 years from, I mean, to say their historic homeland doesn't even begin, it's a superficial way of saying it, because to be Copt is to be Egyptian. For hundreds of years, I mean, Copt means Egyptian. Egyptian means Copt. And Copts were a majority of Egypt well into the Muslim era. But now, as Sam notes with regret, sadness, and a sense of the unknown, now Copts have begun the great emigration outward. There are now 550 Coptic churches outside Egypt. Coptic Christianity is a growing church, except it is dying in Egypt because of the repression and persecution, combination of state power and Islamic extremism. Where does this lead? Can a Coptic church survive without a strong pillar in Egypt? Can a Coptic church survive without much Coptic Christianity in Egypt in its future? It is a tragic question, even to ask. But sadly, as Sam notes, this is not a hypothetical. So, Sam, for your courage in addressing all these issues, Coptic history among itself and with the world around it, taking on the pillars of the establishment of Middle East historians, for explaining the unexplainable about Egyptian politics today, and then asking the tragic but urgent question about the future of Copts in the world today. Thank you. Thank you very much. I commend this book without reservation. Sam.
Well, it's very hard to comment on all those kind words and comments about the book. I've known Robert since I came to Washington, perhaps in 2009, 2010, when I met him for the first time. But as a younger Egyptian, perhaps when Al-Hora was beginning, I was following his program from on Al-Hora, where he would have the guests from the Arab world, the guests from Washington, and to explain Washington, basically, to the Arab world. And it was a very different program from the things that one used to watch in the region. In the region, we have built all those narratives about what happens in Washington, the conspiracies that take place in Washington. But to actually see Washington, see the policy makers comment and debate the ideas, that was something very different. I think Robert has grasped or has presented really the what the book is about. It's a complex story. When Fuad Ajami first asked me to write this book, it was both for me a great joy and, in a sense, one that I took with very great reluctance. It was a great joy because it's an excellent series of books that includes such acclaimed authors such as Charlie Hill, Fuad Ajami, and Bernard Lewis. But it was also a challenge in the sense that I personally had attempted all my life to stay away from the Coptic issue. The Coptic issue, my political ideas had taken me afar from it, to first being a Ba'athist at a young age, to the promises of liberalism after that. But in all of that, I had attempted to deny that aspect of identity. In a sense, I had fallen prey to the liberal narrative that I now attempted to deconstruct, that there was a choice to be made. You could either be a Copt or an Egyptian. You couldn't be both at the same time. There was a conflict there that needed one to choose one side. But writing this book was a fascinating experience, perhaps a personal journey for me along the way. I discovered things that I didn't know about Egyptian history writing it. The basic narratives that you are taught in Egypt about basic history, about the story of the liberal age and many other things, even the church's official narrative, is very different from what you see in those stories as you research them. There are two dominating narratives in explaining the situation of Copts in Egypt. The first is naturally that of persecution. Copts have always been persecuted. The Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, eternally suffering, declining in numbers throughout the centuries. The other narrative, of course, is that of national unity. The Copts and Muslims have always lived in perfect eternal harmony in Egypt, and it's only those evil foreign forces that attempt to divide them, to wedge those differences between them. But Copts and Muslims can live in harmony and have lived in the past. The first narrative, of course, removes any agency from Copts, and that's something that I hope people see in the book. Yes, Copts have been persecuted in Egypt, but they've not been only helpless victims. In years of decline in Coptic learning, you get a man like Pope Kyrillos IV, or as it's pronounced in the West, Cyril IV. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a pope comes only for 7 years, and he builds the first modern schools for females in Egypt. Out of nowhere. First female education in Egypt is not brought by a secular modernizing ruler, but by a Coptic pope. He imports the printing press from Europe, the second printing press in the country after that of Muhammad Ali. He starts reforming the church as an institution. He starts educating people. 5 different schools. He opens modern schools. He revives the Coptic language. When we look at Egypt's prime ministers after that, 20, 30 years after that, 4 of Egypt's future prime ministers graduate from that main Coptic school. So while the narrative of persecution is there, you also get the story of an endurance of a people, of agency on behalf of people choosing to shape their own futures, shape their own church. When we come to the modern times of a complete decline in the Coptic church under Pope Usab II, this is in the late 40s and early 50s, of corruption inside the church, a time where any sane person might not choose a life of the church. And you come to a generation of Egypt's brightest men. Saad Aziz was the youngest graduate of the law faculty in Egypt's history. And he leaves all that. He's first not admitted to the bar because of how young he is. He leaves all that to choose the life of the desert. In a corrupted church, in a church that is facing scandals and destruction internally. Yusuf Iskandar was a very successful pharmacist. He leaves his pharmacy and chooses that to revive the Coptic church. When you go through those stories of the revivalists, the modern movement inside the church, it's a very different story from one of eternal persecution. It's in a sense the Coptic story has been one of two faces, twin stories together. Yes, it's a story of decline, but it's also one of survival. Yes, it's a story of decay, but it's one of endurance as well. You see that when we remember that in a moment in history, Christianity was well spread throughout North Africa. Only Alexandria stands today. The places where St. Augustine walked no longer know what Christianity is. Only Alexandria remained. There's something there about an endurance of a church and of a people. That's the first aspect. The second one is also a personal story for me. The conventional wisdom about liberalism in Egypt. If you're an Egyptian liberal, and I use the term obviously very loosely here in this case, then you naturally believe that Egypt was heaven on earth, and then Gamal Abdel Nasser came in 1952 and destroyed heaven. So growing up, my basic question was, if it was so great, where did Nasser come from in the first place? Is it such a coincidence that Nasser and his fellow conspirators started all or grew up in that liberal age? We noticed that at the same time, another person, a bit younger, started another organization, the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. The two main Salafi organizations in Egypt, 1913 and 1926. The proto-fascist movement in Egypt, Young Egypt, starts in 1930. Is it such a coincidence that in this golden age, in this liberal age in Egypt, we get all those illiberal movements? Doesn't that mean there was something wrong there? Doesn't it mean that there was something there that led to the emergence of all those illiberal movements? So it's been a personal quest in a sense to find an answer to that. What was it that was wrong with the beginning? Where did Egypt go wrong? Was it from the very beginning? Was it in the middle? Where did this destructive path that we are set on begin? The conventional wisdom has been that there were great liberals. They had imported the ideas of Europe, attempted to modernize their countries, and then something happened. Often historians call the late 1930s or 30s in general as the crisis of orientation in Egyptian historiography. A new generation emerges that rejects, not a lot of explanation is given of why, but that rejects this orientation towards Europe. Taha Hussein's book in 1938 about the future of education in Egypt is often given as the turning point in history. He is there warning. Taha Hussein was advocated that Egypt did not belong to an Arab or an Islamic world. It belonged to a Mediterranean culture. No one after that ever talked about the West or the Mediterranean culture as belonging to it. Egypt became Islamic for some, part of the Arab world, its leaders for others. But that was the moment of supposed change. Perhaps the only history book ever written about Egypt that attempted to challenge these was a book by a historian of the name of Nadav Safran, who wrote challenging that narrative and explaining, looking at the intellectual history of Egypt, what was going on there. Some things weren't as people were portraying it. Very different in a sense that the work, this canonical work of Albert Hourani. My attempt here was to go even more in depth than what Nadav Safran had done, to try to look at those early stories of liberals and where they came from. And it is that, looking at their relationship with the state, that in a sense explains both the failure of liberalism in the past and its current predicament in Egypt. The first modernizers, and I think that's the best word to describe people like Ahmad Lutfi Sayyid, Muhammad Abdu, as Muhammad Rifat Tahtawi, or any of these thinkers, that they are modernizers and not necessarily liberals. The question for them was, how do we catch up? Napoleon had come to Egypt in 1798, and the old order was beginning to crumble. Bernard Lewis frames the question brilliantly. What went wrong? Why have those Europeans advanced and we haven't? Why is it that those men that we had met decades earlier, centuries earlier, as the Crusaders, had suddenly turned into the modern Frenchmen? What is it that happened in the middle that changed all this? And the beginnings, you see the beginnings of answers by the rulers and by those thinkers emerging within the state apparatus. Muhammad Ali begins the process of modernization by creating a massive state dedicated to an army. If the current joke is that the Egyptian army has a state, well, that's Muhammad Ali's state. His sole focus is building a large army. He doesn't have time for those ideas of Europe. Modernization is simply, let's copy the technology they have. Do they have a printing press? Let's import one. Do they have modern weaponry? We'll have some as well. There's a famous story there about him ordering books to be translated. The man couldn't read and write. He'd have some of his assistants to translate works, European works, to him to read for him at night. And someone thought about translating Machiavelli's The Prince. And Muhammad Ali, the book is translated day by day, so every day 10 pages or so are read to him. And the man listens to the first day, second day, third day. By the fourth day, he tells the man, stop. I've listened to you for 3 days thinking that I can learn something. I have no use for this book. I know so many more tricks than he does. That, in a sense, is the crisis. Because in reality, Machiavelli was not a book about tricks. Machiavelli was modernity par excellence. Machiavelli was the break with traditional, with historical philosophy. That part, grasping the ideas behind modernity, was not there. His grandson, Ismail, attempts to copy a different part of Europe. He attempts to copy the outer layers of civilization. They have nice opera houses. We'll have an opera house as well. They have the nice buildings. We'll do as well. The two funny episodes, he's told that European monarchs, upon assuming the crown, give a speech to their people. So he asks his assistant to write one and never reads it beforehand, and doesn't tell the assistant anything what he should write, and then discovers while reading it that he's committed himself to promises that he never knew he wanted to commit himself to, actually, which forces him then to go into a whole dispute with the Suez Canal Authority Company and then take the issue to Napoleon III of France. Another episode of him that captures this attitude, looking at what the world, becoming part of the world meant, was when he was told that basically all European countries have empires in Africa. Well, so do we. We should have one as well. So he embarks on this war with Ethiopia, complete failure, we lose the war, but upon the army leaving Cairo, he looks to some of the Europeans standing there and tells them, my country is no longer in Africa, it is now part of Europe. Those attitudes then meet the shock of the Europeans actually come. Not a 3-year short episode in the form of the French invasion, but in the form of the British invasion that occupies the country, stays in the country from 1882 until 1954, when they finally leave. Suddenly the West is not only a question of the other to catch up with, to become like, it's also an occupying force. The West becomes, we develop a love-hate relationship with that West. We admire many things of that West, but they are also the people that are occupying us. How do we accept that? How do we deal with that West? How do we deal with the question of what went wrong, of Islam? Is Islam compatible with modernity or not? Every thinker from that point onward attempts to answer that question. Muhammad Abdu says, well, sure, Islam encouraged science in the past. In fact, in the old times, science was much richer in the Islamic world in the Middle Ages than it was in Europe. So there's nothing really wrong with Islam of itself. It's been corrupted throughout the centuries. We need to return to an original, purer form of that in order to advance again. Ahmad Lutfi Said and his comrades don't have time for this. They don't believe that those early generations of Muslims, the Salaf, from which the word Salafism emerges, have an answer for their future. For them, it is about copying Europe. But how do you deal with the question of Islam? The answer for them is simple. Partly, in a sense, they have two sides of them. Partly they get it, part of it they get from Lord Cromer, the man who is really the founder of modern Egypt and not Muhammad Ali. And the other part they get, interestingly enough, from Darwin and from ideas of social Darwinism. From Cromer they get the idea that religion is problematic in the public sphere. We need to keep it aside. We can't even attempt to modernize religion, because we've seen what happened with Abdu when he tried to do that, and the battles he faced from traditionalists in Al-Azhar with his attempts at modernization. So Islam is, in a sense, a bomb that is left untouched, better left untouched unless it explodes, or else it will explode in our faces. But from social Darwinism, they get the idea that, well, the world's going to change in the future. Who will talk about those issues anyway in 50 years' time? When we look at the debates in the Egyptian constitution of 1923, when the issue of proportional representation was suggested and debated, should Copts have special seats allocated to them? And you read the arguments done by Egypt's great liberal thinkers, it was basically, guys, now people care about it. In 20 years' time, no one will think about Christian and Muslim. These issues will no longer be on the agenda. People would have advanced. People will disagree about more important issues touching their lives. But the general attitude was one of Islam is the problem, better left outside of the political sphere completely. In a sense, it was also a reflection of their French secularism. These men were completely enchanted with France. No one talked about an American secular model whereby religion can be part of the public sphere. Religion was an evil to be banished from it. It is only with an understanding of Islam as a problem, as Ahmad Lutfi Sayyid would have articulated it in a special room without saying it publicly, of course. It is only with understanding that we can understand the Muslim Brotherhood slogan, Islam is the solution. It is the direct answer to Lutfi Sayyid and the other liberal thinkers' formulation. These men, those modernizers, had their eyes only on, let's catch up to Europe. Now, catching up is very problematic for any country, because no matter how much you try, the other is not standing idle. The West is advancing itself. So we import some things from them and try to advance, and they've moved another 5 years ahead, another 10 years. How do we catch up? Naturally, the answer is we can't depend on individual initiative. Only the state can manage a complete modernization of the country. Only through the means of the state can we actually become like those people that we admire and hate in the West? So the natural attitude is we need the state. And if you're one that your job is a civil servant, your basic conception of the world is that the state is the one to change it. No one is talking about limiting the state's power. No one is discussing, well, the crisis of the individual with the collective and with the state, the rise of the European independent bourgeoisie that gives rise to liberalism, that's not there. Whatever liberalism exists in the Arab world comes from people whose sole life evolves around the state. So it's no surprise that their very formulations about the future comes from that. And since you believe that only the state can modernize Egypt, can only make it better, well, that's the only entity you can talk to. Why bother addressing those ignorant masses that you live amongst? Why bother convincing them with your argument if all you need to do is to talk to the one man, the ruler, the man you dream of, the Muhammad Ali, the Ismail, the Nasser afterwards, the man that will manage the modernization, forcing it on a reluctant population. So a natural tendency of separation from the very country you live in emerges. A tendency to despise the people that you live amongst. When you see the crisis of the liberal constitutionalists as they lose the first elections to one of their fellows in the past, Saad Zaghloul, who uses a populist message to completely win the masses. and you read their arguments, they're not very different from the arguments that today's self-proclaimed liberals are presenting. When you read today one of Egypt's writers saying that people that can't read and write shouldn't be allowed to vote, illiterates shouldn't be allowed to vote, well, that's not something very different from what Ahmad Lutfi Said and his fellow thinkers were saying, from Muhammad Hussein Haikal, from Taha Hussein, all of these thinkers. So the crisis, the attitude to despise the people and to frown upon them, to only talk to the leader who will enforce that change, that's there from the very beginning. Today's Coptic church, as Rob mentioned, is growing outside of Egypt. When Pope Shenouda when Pope Shenouda became Pope in 1970, Copts had two churches in the United States, one in LA and one in New Jersey. When he died in 2012, Copts had 202 churches in the United States of America alone, out of 550 Coptic churches abroad. We know there are about 2,000 plus or minus Coptic churches inside Egypt. So we're talking that there are today 1/5 of the churches of the Coptic church is outside of the country where it has built its identity. Immigrants or immigration, Coptic immigration has started from the 1950s. People escaped Nasser. People escaped Nasser's idea. Copts escaped Nasser's ideas and the feeling that they no longer had a place in the country. Nasser is often portrayed as the secular ruler against the Brotherhood. Surely he was against the Brotherhood. He had a different conception of what the state's nationalist project should be. But his era was not that kind to the Copts. While many Copts, for example, lost their land as part of the land reclamation project, not a single Christian received any of the land distributed to the peasants of the country. There's something there. Education under Nasser was slowly being Islamized by the Minister of Education at the time, who was a fellow member of the original 13 that conspired to remove King Farouk. The changes, the growth into Al-Azhar as an institution was happening from the 50s. Nasser had taken over Al-Azhar's in religious endowments, their money, but in return to get their official support in fighting the Islamists and for his nationalist project, he was willing to provide for religious education. We have numbers of students at Al-Azhar rising from something like 5,000 students in 1952 to 1.9 million students today in the different, whether the university or the pre-university, the schools of Al-Azhar. So that growth is going on. This pressure in society is going on. And with Sadat, then comes the rise of the Islamists again. Then comes the threat to Islamists in the universities, in daily life, the attacks on churches, the Islamist insurgency later on under Mubarak's rule. So all of these things are leading Copts to leave the country. Some of them seeking a better future, like their fellow Muslims, while others, it is the question of religious persecution that is driving them. And that community has only grown since the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring might lead in the end to something better in Egypt. I'm a pessimist, but it might. There might be a more democratic Egypt sometime in the future. But some things that are happening today are very hard to change. Once people leave Egypt and go and choose new lives in the United States or Canada or Australia, there's no going back there. No one's going to go to America and then in 20 years' time go back to Egypt. We're seeing a humongous demographic change in the Middle East. And it's one that's really hardly noticed by anyone. People frame the question of Coptic immigration or the loss of Christianity in the Middle East in general as one of religious freedom. It's a nice thing to discuss on the side after we've really talked about the big national security issues. Well, it's not just a religious freedom issue. Those religious minorities, Bernard Lewis had documented in the beginning of the 20th century, the region was about 25%, 33% non-Muslim. Jewish communities, Egypt, Iraq, Morocco, everywhere in the region. Christian communities everywhere, different other religions and forms, Druze, Zoroastrians, all this religious mosaic that had transcended time and survived until modern times. Well, it's no longer that picture. Today, the Middle East, outside of the State of Israel, is 3% Christian. That 3%, the largest bulk in it, the absolute majority in it, are Egypt's Copts. Besides them, you've got the Lebanese Maronites, you've got the Syrian Christians, and what remains of Iraqi Christians after 2/3 of them had already left. If the Copts of Egypt leave, we're talking about a huge demographic shift in the region. The very region, the fabric of it, is no longer what we used to know. Those religious minorities had played a very important role in the past. They were the link with the West, the bridge. When one thinks of the revival of the Arab language, one has to return to the works of Father Louis Sheikhu in Lebanon. When one talks about the beginnings of Arab nationalism, one has to go back to George Antonius. When one thinks of the Ba'ath, one has to mention Michel Aflaq, or of the Palestinian Christians George Habash, of Egypt's thinkers Salama Musa. All of this might be lost. The loss is not just for the Coptic Church. The challenge is not just for the Coptic Church. The challenge is also for Egypt and the other countries in the region. This loss of Christianity from the region is one that will have implications. People talk about the youth growth in the region, the new youth bulge. Sure, that's an important demographic change, but there's another one happening that people largely don't focus on. For the Coptic Church, it's a blessing and a challenge. The church is flourishing outside of Egypt's borders, but it is in decline inside of the country. I wrote an article in today's Wall Street Journal about the loss of one of the ancient churches in the country, a church from the 4th or 5th century that had withstood the test of times. Generations had passed on it, from Byzantines to Arab dynasties, and today it no longer stands in Egypt. The Coptic percentage in Egypt is perhaps much larger, definitely, than that of the previous community that was kicked out of the country's Jews. So it is natural that people look and think, well, what happened to the Jews of Egypt cannot happen to its Copts. The Jews, after all, were, at the largest estimate, from 80 to 100,000. Surely, when one talks about the Copts, there is no room in the West or anywhere for 6 or 8 million Copts. Surely they will all stay. And naturally, this change wouldn't happen, or I'm not suggesting that it would happen in a day or two. But if we see a continuation of the current trends of immigration, where Copts are not only going to the places they traditionally went to, the United States, Canada, and Australia, and Western world, but also to Georgia. When my father told me for the first time the Copts from my village in Egypt were going to Georgia, my natural reaction was, Georgia, USA, right? Well, no, it's Georgia, former USSR. There are about 6,000 Copts now in Georgia. Why? Because it's cheap. Because it's an easier place to go to than the West. My local Coptic church here in Fairfax, Virginia, we've had a community of about 3,000 Copts before Egypt's revolution. We've had 15 to 20 families come every month. We're now a community of 4,500 Copts. We're opening sister smaller churches in Arlington and other places, in Chantilly, because of the influx of refugees. This is a challenge to the Coptic Church that it is perhaps extremely unprepared for. In a sense, the Church has transcended and survived persecution. But how do you deal with an open market competition within Christian denominations and sects in the West? How do you deal with the modern challenges of the modern world, of atheism, of alcohol, of drugs usage, all those problems that are not at the same size in Egypt as they are in the immigrant communities? What does it mean to be a Copt when Egypt is no longer the place you call home? What does it mean to be a Copt if you're living in Minnesota, in Philadelphia? What does that identity mean for you? What does it actually mean for the church if at one point in the future, 20 years' time, 30 years' time, that the majority of its followers would be outside of Egypt's borders? What would that mean for the very doctrines of the church? These are all challenges that the church will be facing in the coming years. And as I've learned from writing this book, we're going to see the twin stories. This has been the endless story that I have seen generation after generation for the Copts. The decline, the decay in the community, the failures in parts, but also the survival and endurance in others, the revival in others. That is likely to be the twin stories that we continue to see in the future. Thank you very much.
Very good, Sam. You just got a glimpse of the depth and the scholarship and the insight that is in Sam Tadros' wonderful book. Let's open the floor to your questions and comments. So please raise your hand, identify yourself, be brief, recognize that you're being taped for posterity, so watch what you say, and I will open the floor with you, sir. There's a microphone coming your way.
My name is Arnold Zeitlin. I've been teaching in China the past 10 years. This is not an area of expertise for me, but I wondered, in view of your remarks about the secular elite, why there hasn't been a more visible secular or civilian face. Oh, it's not on. That better? I guess. I don't know. It doesn't sound like. No, it doesn't. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, so I'll repeat the question. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just wondered, in view, for example, of the departure of Mr. Baradei, how much of a secular elite really support this coup?
Well, Sam, I'll turn to you. When you look at the secular elite, the liberal elite, whatever term you want to use, how deep is the support for the military intervention as of July 3rd, and then the crackdown from last week?
Well, I'd say it's very deep. I think let's first define who these people are that we describe as liberals or seculars. It's generally an amalgam of different groups that only share a rejection of the Islamist project or fear that project. You get the business community who obviously fear what an Islamist project might mean for their businesses, the Copts who are naturally afraid of that, the human rights community, the different leftist groups that you have in the country. You have a strong Trotskyite movement in the country, for example, the Revolutionary Socialists. All this amalgam, Nasserites, Arab nationalists, all of these together. So they share different ideas, and perhaps that's part of the explanation of why they failed to build something, because they're unable to provide any ideological counterpart to Islamism. But for them, there is no other option but the military. The only people that have come out against what's going on in Egypt have been Mr. Baradei in his resignation, and Amr Hamzawi, a previous parliamentarian, in his articles in one of Egypt's newspapers. Outside of that, there have been very few voices, if any, that have rejected this binary choice between Islamism or the Brotherhood and the military. So generally speaking, I think it's overwhelming support.
So, Sam, what would have to occur to transform this broad support for the military action into an effective civilian government that may eventually evolve into an elected civilian government? How does that transformation take place?
Well, it depends on whether they want to or not. The big question now is, of course, you've removed a president from the Muslim Brotherhood from power. Does anyone actually think you're going to allow the Muslim Brotherhood to win any elections anytime soon? Of course not. Or else you're basically saying you're going to lose your head the next minute. I mean, if the Muslim Brotherhood wins any next elections, this will naturally mean the heads of those generals and the politicians who supported it. So I think we're definitely talking about a system of competitive autocracy, can we call it something like that, whereby elections do take place, but whereby part of the population, part of the ideological fabric of the country is excluded from the political process, and thus creating perhaps the seeds for instability in the future.
And just to pursue this, if under the new regime there is, say, a ban on political parties based on religion, how will that affect the Coptic community?
Well, the Coptic community would be extremely happy. You don't have Coptic political parties at the moment or anytime in the future. I mean, there's probably some crazy guy who wants to do a Coptic political party somewhere, but there's no meaningful or any significant movement into that regard. So the Coptic community will definitely welcome that. It would welcome a political process where its gravest enemy, the most threatening enemy to it, is excluded and doesn't have a chance to dominate the political sphere and threaten the Coptic community.
Okay. Yes, please, in the front. We'll try again with the mic.
Thanks. Okay. I'm Farnaz Isbahani from the Wilson Center. My question for you, Sam, is I'm working also focusing on Pakistan and looking at what's happening with Muslim minorities and non-Muslim minorities. My question to you is, what is the curriculum like in Egypt? Because what I have found studying the curriculum in Pakistan is the hatred of the Hindu, of other minorities, including, say, Shia Muslims, etc., is all there. From your Islamiyat classes to social studies to Pakistan studies, the otherness of the minority is there from the moment a child goes to a public school. What do you say about this in Egypt?
I don't think you have something at the same level of what you have in places like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, which I'm familiar with its textbooks there and the amount of hatred of the other that exists in their textbooks. In Egypt, the Minister of Education under Mubarak for some 10 years took a great attention, paid a lot of attention to this issue of limiting any hateful messages in the educational curriculum. However, the problem is much more the people that educate themselves, the teachers. Teaching is not, doesn't provide one with a very bright future. It's one of the worst schools to enter in university, basically. If your GPA is not that, or if your grades in high school are not that good, you end up in the teacher's department. And the result is that the quality of the people there is very bad. And worse is that anyone that doesn't get the favor of through the corruption or from the bureaucracy ends up teaching in the areas away from Cairo. And the result is that it's no surprise that the places where you get the worst extremism is the places where you send the worst teachers. That's the south of Egypt, basically. So when you go to places, the impoverished schools in Sohag, for example. Sohag is perhaps the poorest governorate in Egypt. That's where you get those teachers that are not well liked or well received in Cairo. And thus the messages that are given to students are extremely hateful of the other. And it's not just education. It's quite hard to listen to a mosque sermon outside of some well-known big mosques in Cairo, in the countryside, for example, that's not hateful towards the other, that does not curse the Jews and the Christians on a daily basis. And this all is built on an already existent mythology. Let me give a fascinating example. Coptic priests wear black. They only wear white when they're holding mass or participating in mass services. And as a result, there has been this consistent Islamist myth in Egypt that the Coptic priests wear black because this is partly out of sadness that Egypt is a Muslim country. And that one day the church hopes that they will renounce the black and wear the white when they celebrate. There's no longer Islam dominates the country, when Egypt is returned like Andalusia or something like that. So fast forward to Mr. Morsi's removal, and you get, of course, again, as I mentioned, they wear white in the masses. So you get a picture of the Coptic Pope ordaining some new bishops, and they're naturally wearing white. So every Islamist website shares the photo saying, see, this proves that the Copts are happy with the coup because now they believe they have ended Islam in Egypt and now they can wear white again. So whatever the education and the mass media is built on already existing myths that have existed for generations, to say the least.
Yes, Hillel on my right, and then we'll get to the back.
Okay. Hillel Fratkin of the Hudson Institute and its Center on Islam. Thanks, both of you, very much. I wanted to ask you a question, Sam, and for that matter, Rob. You spoke before of the contempt that the modernizers had for their fellow citizens. Contempt that was based to some degree on the fact that their fellow citizens were traditional and pious. And therefore, they had relatively little impact on that segment of the population, which is the majority. In the present circumstances, some substantial portion of that population turned against Morsi and the Brotherhood. In your opinion, and Rob's opinion, is there some new language that the secular elites, or the secular, whether they're elite or not, could now find to a language that would be common to them and also to the majority of the population, which would limit the future impact of Islamism in whatever form it comes back?
There's the experiments of the past. Saad Zaghloul found an answer to win against his competitors with going populist, basically. Nationalism, using populist nationalism as a means to win against his former colleagues in the Ummah party that became the Liberal Constitutionalist. Nasser did, in a sense, something similar by, again, populist nationalism. The details of that nationalism are, of course, different in each case, from an exclusively Egyptian nationalism to an Arab nationalism under Nasser. But in a sense, that's the winning answer that they might come up with. And we see the beginnings of that currently in Egypt. Extreme xenophobia, attacks on the Western world and its portrayal of the Egyptian people's will, images of the man and the people, General Sisi. Those familiar with Maoist art, for example, would recognize immediately the images that they see in Egypt. The masses in the Tahrir Square with the general transcending them and above it called, "O Field Marshal of the People," that kind of language. So I would say they would have to shed, if the liberals, or what we term as liberals, would choose that route, it would mean that they would shed any liberal ideas and purely choose populist nationalism as a way to defeat Islamism.
Hillel, I hope it's not a sign of false modesty to suggest that I haven't the foggiest idea. I don't think that the people who are at the heights of running Egypt today, August 21st, know the answer to this question. I don't think they have a plan for a year from now, 2 years, 5 years, and if they don't have a plan, then I don't know what their plan is. So,
Yes.
And I don't say that because I just don't know. I really don't think they know. Rafi Danziger?
Thank you. As I was listening to your brilliant summary of the history of the Copts, it struck me how similar it was to the history of the Jews in diaspora. I almost felt that you can say the word Jew instead of Copt, and you get basically the same story of combination of persecution and resilience and innovation. I was wondering if this is your take too on that. And number two, what have been the relationships between the Copts and the Jews in Egypt?
I think there are some historical similarities. Of course, until the modern establishment of the State of Israel, the Jews had to survive purely as a diaspora community. While the Copts, even now in the diaspora, Egypt is still there and there are Copts there. So there's something different there in the stories. Although when you look back at history, and I discuss in my book one of the worst periods of persecution of Copts in Egypt under the Mamluks, where basically you had the decline of Coptic churches from something like 2048 in the year 1200 to 112 churches in the year 1600. 400-year period, complete eradication or attempted eradication of Christianity from Egypt. And you see there the usage of propaganda, the mob violence, very similar to what you got towards the Jews, especially in Eastern Europe in various pogroms. The relationship between the Copts and the Jews, I would say, has not been always perfect. There has been a historical competition as minorities in the region who gets the jobs that the rulers allow them to take. So the two communities have obviously competed in the past, in the Middle Ages under the rule of Islam. Anti-Semitism is a vice that is spread throughout the Muslim Arab world, not exclusively to its Muslim populations, meaning that many Christians there share extremely anti-Semitic and vile hatred. Part of it is built on traditional Jew hatred that church doctrines still have from the Middle Ages, something similar to what was going on with Western Christians. But and part of it is, of course, an attempt to portray Christians as more loyal to the country than others. Once there has been this conflict with Israel, it was very important for the church to appear as extremely nationalist, to appear that it supports the nation and we're not the traitors towards the country. So you can see within that context the Coptic Pope's decision to ban Copts from going to Jerusalem, visiting the performing pilgrimage to Jerusalem or any of these things.
Yes, two gentlemen over there, 2 seats away from each other. If you could identify yourself, please.
Sure. My name is Cvetin Chilimanov. I'm a journalist from the Macedonian Information Agency. And obviously we follow these events in Egypt very closely, sharing the common Orthodox heritage, but also the region in which the Arab Spring is causing so many troubles. I would like to ask, you've pointed out the fact that there's a huge portion of the Egyptian population which are not represented at this point in the government and likely will not be, quite possibly a majority. Do you see a way for a transformation of the Islamist movements in the region? Specifically, that there is an example in Turkey where there is an impeccably Islamist government which has very good credibility in the street, has in the municipalities, they run the ban liquor in some cases, or protect the traditional moral values. But they're also very have espoused the ideology of free markets, have deregulated the country, have reduced the role of the state in the economy, something which you have also pointed out. Do you see that this could be a possible path for creating a electable and Islamist movement which would confirm with the interests of Egypt and the United States?
I think that's, in a sense, the most important question about Egypt's future. What happens to its Muslim Brotherhood and to the larger Islamist scene? I have no doubt that the military will win this round. But I also stress that it is around, meaning that this is not the end of the war. The military will crush the Muslim Brotherhood. There's no doubt that they have the larger guns and that they are willing to kill as many as it takes. So the military is going to win, that is for sure. The question is, how do the Islamists answer then the situation they are in? Part of the question will depend on whether the Muslim Brotherhood exists as an organization or doesn't, meaning whether the military's crushing of the leadership then leads to a disintegration among its members, with each of them taking a separate route. I think in a sense there are three routes there in the future in front of Islamism, Egyptian Islamism. The first is that of Turkey, obviously, where you moderate the Erdogan lesson after the coup against, or the partly coup against Erbakan, and you provide a more moderate image of your party with newer faces, and you win according to the rules of the game and take it step by step until you transform and change society in the end 10, 15 years after. So much slower pace than what the Brotherhood was attempting to do in just a matter of months. The second route is naturally that of Sayyid Qutb, where generations now where Egyptian Islamists now will be affected by the same idea that generations before them were, that, well, you really can't do it through the ballot boxes and you have to go through the bullets. There's no other way. We were denied our rightful victory. We played by their rules and they didn't accept it. The only explanation is that they're against Islam, and thus this is a state of jahiliyyah. The basic argument Sayyid Qutb has made, and we can only fight it through the bullets. So a growth of an Islamist insurgency. Sinai is a perfect place for this to happen. Matruh, the Western Desert, also a perfect place next to Libya, with easy routes there, easy border, jihadist organizations already in Libya. So you have two fronts that might emerge as Islamist insurgencies there. And of course, that's the message that someone like Ayman al-Zawahiri is making. I told you so. I explained that the Muslim Brotherhood's route is not the right one, that you can only do it through my way. And it's very important to keep in mind here that Ayman is an Egyptian. He fought in Egypt for 20 plus years. This is not some alien country to him. This is a place where the whole thing started, where he started fighting against the internal enemy before joining bin Laden to fight against the external enemy. So if Al-Qaeda is under pressure in Afghanistan, Pakistan, if its brand is no longer as appealing as it was 10 years ago, what would be better than creating an Islamist insurgency in the Sinai that targets Israel, rebrands the organization as one fighting against the Zionists, and gains mass support and a safe haven in the Sinai? So that route is obviously there. The third route is perhaps a mixture of Islamism with leftist ideas. Something similar to what Ali Shariati was thinking with Islamic Marxism in Iran, something that Sayyid Qutb touched upon in his work on social justice in Islam. So a much more populist Islamism that mixes the basic Islamist ideas with arguments of for the poor people, that fighting against the rich and the powerful, and. I think these are basically the three routes that are there, and they're not all contradictory, meaning that the three of them can largely happen at the same time. A majority might continue to attempt to represent itself in electoral politics, while a significant minority will go and join terrorist cells in the Sinai and otherwise.
If I could just add two brief comments about this. First, the Turkish model, I think people generally fail to recognize what a steep road this is. I mean, it was a half century of strict secular rules stripping religion from all public life. I mean, Egypt is nowhere near that experience. Well before the opportunity for, serious electoral competition, and even then you had a couple of military interventions to squeeze out the most radical aspects of the Islamic-oriented party until you finally ended up after 70 years with Erdogan, and that's what you get after that huge experience. So I mean, Egypt is just not down that path, haven't even begun going down that path. The second observation, in terms of the Islamists turning to the sort of radical path, I don't think that the military leadership would necessarily oppose that. I mean, I think this is, if this is what they choose, this is what the military knows to deal with. This was not the challenge. This is a challenge that the state was able to cope with in Egypt over the last several decades. Yes, they took down Sadat, but the state survived, and the state not only survived, but in essence prevailed. It prevailed so much that it eventually allowed them to run politically, and which maybe had been a mistake in the view of the state, but now it's the revenge of the state. So I don't think, if that's what the Muslim Brotherhood chooses, I don't think that the military would be so fearful of this option, because this is what they know how to deal with.
And they're certainly framing it as a war against terror.
Yes. There was a gentleman behind you, Doug, on your left. Yes, sir. And then, yes.
Can you compare and contrast Egypt with its neighbors in terms of the tax revenue that goes to support the construction or the maintenance of churches and the payment of the clergy?
Okay, question about tax revenues and payment. Doug, I'm going to ask you to pose your question.
Hi, Doug Feith. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson. What I'm wondering is your view of the Egyptian military, and whether the Brotherhood has any possibility by turning out in the streets and ensuring large levels of violence of cracking the Egyptian military. I mean, is there any possibility that you could see groups of Egyptians in the military deciding they don't want to kill the people and they will go over to the Muslim Brotherhood side, kind of roughly on the model of what happened in Russia in World War I? Do they have a prayer of any kind of help from elements of the Egyptian military?
And then last, I'd like to pose a question to you, prompted not least by our host, Nina Shea, and her important role in promoting religious freedom. What do Copts want from America? What would Copts like to hear from our leaders, from our public officials? What is the best message that we could be sending? What is the most useful message that we could be sending? So there, you have 4 minutes, 3 easy, brief questions.
If I understood the question correctly about tax revenues, none of the tax revenues go to churches, meaning that the churches Copts donate privately to churches, but the government doesn't give a single penny to churches. It does, of course, give money to mosques in Egypt. It spends on religious education. It provides services for, Azhar as a religious and educational institute. It provides trips for people to perform al-Hajj. There are many aspects many elements that the Egyptian state spends on Muslim religious education and religious activity, but none on Copts. This is solely based on people donating for the churches. Concerning the military, I think that's perhaps the Brotherhood's best bet, but it's one that it has failed to have so far. Partly, I think, because the army has so far made the police perform the worst crimes, which the police, of course, is more than happy to do so. So the Egyptian police has felt extremely humiliated and crushed from the 2011 uprising, losing their dominance on the streets, and this is payback time. So the police is very happy to perform this. Yes, some army units are helping, but mostly it's the police doing the crackdown. If the level of violence is to increase and more army units are to to take part. I think the likelihood of any crack, if anything might happen in that regard, would be on the conscript levels and not on the officers or the ones active duty officers. The conscripts come from Egyptian society at large, meaning that these people 1 year ago were electing Islamists in Egyptian parliamentary elections with 72%, as was the rest of the population. So it's not outside of the possible that conscripts might refuse to open fire on demonstrators or any of that. That's possible. But the army itself, I doubt that they would be involved into that level that would create a crisis for them and a split within the army. What do Copts want? I don't think they know. Partly is the Copts have, as largely a first generation immigrant community in the US, they've not really learned how to operate in the American system. They continue to protest in front of the White House, not realizing that policy actually happens inside the building and not for those protesting outside. And that is a sad reflection of the state of the community. I remember we've had a couple of events where we brought Coptic priests and thinkers and asked them that question: what do you want America to do? And they don't have a single answer. Partly it's because no one wants to advocate for a Western intervention into their homeland. They do realize very well that this would mean a price paid by Copts living inside of Egypt, and that any word said here, Bishop Thomas gave a speech here at Hudson a couple of years ago, and he faced, to say the least, a firestorm in Egypt that forced him to remain outside the country for a while. It's not likely to be a very welcoming message when Copts ask for things from America. At the same time, it's also a reflection of the Coptic predicament. You are neither geographically concentrated in a single area whereby one could ponder the possibility of a safe haven style of thing, a federal system, anything of the sort. You're not, your numbers are significant, but as a percentage of the Egyptian population, you're not enough to affect the country's future. So your options aren't that many. Your best hope is an Egypt that is inclusive for everyone. So the basic message they would ask the United States is that the United States would insist on an inclusive Egypt that welcomes all of its citizens. When we look at the attacks that happened 1 week ago on Copts in the Egypt, an attack that is really unprecedented. We have to go back to the year 1321 to have that many churches attacked on the same day. And the Muslim Brotherhood obviously incited for calling for those attacks. The level of hatred and incitement on their websites and messages is tremendous. And obviously some of their members and other Islamists have participated physically in those attacks. But the Egyptian state has also not been there, meaning anyone who actually works on the Coptic issue could have easily told you which churches would have been attacked. It's no surprise that the church in Delga was attacked in August 2013. It was attacked in 2007, in 2009, 2012, July 2013. Of course it will be attacked again when something like this takes place. So the failure of the Egyptian regime to protect the Christians, I think, is something that the United States has to stress with that regime, that if you claim to be against the extremism of the Brotherhood, the first step that you can do, the easiest step, is to actually protect the Christians that are bearing most of the attacks and most of the violence.
Okay, thank you. Please join me in thanking the Hudson Institute, but in thanking Sam Tadros. Please, excellent book. Please tweet, tell everybody about it. Sam, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Really,
it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.